May I now bring the board to the next item of business, which is item 9 on our agenda, which is managing conflicts of interest. And I'm going to invite Ian to introduce the paper.
Thank you very much, Chair. In this item, the board is asked to consider 3 distinct and highly interrelated issues concerning the effective management of conflicts of interest. First, within clinical commissioning groups. Second, right across the wider healthcare system. And third, NHS England's own internal policies and processes. Common to all 3 elements is the primary objective of strengthening public confidence through robust and proportionate rules and transparency to reveal conflicts of interest and ensure their effective and consistent management. And in so doing, better to protect individual clinicians, organisations and the NHS. First, on clinical commissioning groups. The benefits of involving clinicians in the commissioning of care will only be secured and sustained if we have arrangements for the management of conflicts of interest that are effective and perceived as such. As a corollary of the introduction of the co-commissioning of primary medical services, NHS England introduced statutory guidance for the first time in December 2014. And since then, we've commissioned an internal audit to review arrangements in a sample of 10 CCGs. And today, we're publishing a summary of that report and our response. We not only are recommending to the board to accept the recommendations arising from that audit report, but we are proposing to go further through a new set of de minimis requirements, and I highlight 4 elements. First, a new requirement for a minimum of 3 lay members for each CCG. Secondly, the appointment of a conflicts of interest guardian, who we propose will be the audit committee chair. Thirdly, an annual audit on conflicts of interest as part of each CCG's internal audit plans. And fourth, clearer rules on gifts and hospitality, declarations of interest and standard processes governing decision-making and dealing with breaches. We believe that a more standardised approach will be broadly, perhaps not universally, welcomed as simpler and easier for local systems. We've worked closely with CCGs and their representative body, NHS Clinical Commissioners, in developing these proposals and also discuss them with audit committee chairs. We are planning to consult during April formally before bringing back proposals to the May board for the final version to be issued and enacted from the end of November this year. And I will pause there and invite the board to consider these proposals.
Right. May I invite any comments from the board on part 1 of the 3 matters that Ian is bringing to us this morning?
I think Malcolm used to say that at the heart of this is you have to believe that the case for clinically led local commissioning is compelling, because by its very nature it introduces conflict. If you don't believe that, then this is not a problem. I happen to believe that clinically led local commissioning is actually critical to allow us to do actually some of the things that Howard's been talking about and the changes in primary care which are at the core of what we're seeking to do. Therefore, these arrangements, and I think the audit committee chair's discussion that I chaired, recognise that actually we have to dramatically improve the management of conflicts. And I think people have got the message that if we don't, then it puts at threat the very basis upon which we do a lot of our business, which I think everyone has seen as a positive step in terms of driving more local ownership and more local accountability. So I think, Ian, it's fair to say these are quite a material step up of where we are at the moment, and we will now need to make sure that they get done every day in every CCG across the country. And we need to help and support that, but there is an accountability on what are independent entities to be able to look after their own conflicts and to manage them appropriately.
I think it's an important thing to note, isn't it, that clinician-led local commissioning doesn't institutionalise conflict of interest, but it institutionalises potential conflict of interest. So the critical thing about the guidance is to identify where potential conflicts may occur and to manage and to mitigate what might otherwise be a serious conflict. And I think what I also get from this paper is an understanding that what we're aiming at is already the best in class within the CCG community, and 30% already have 3 or more lay members on the CCG, but also to spread best practice across all of the CCG community, reflecting, I would say, in many respects, the traditional but also transformed practice across local government, central government, and business in ensuring that conflicts of interest are avoided through proper management. So may we invite further comments to...
I guess, I mean, I think this is important in that what we're asking for really is a shift in behaviours again. So I'm just wondering about how the conversation is going to be had with the CCGs about what shifts in behaviours they're going to be making, how we're going to know they've made them, because obviously having this in writing is the first bit. The second bit is getting the right relationships between NHS England, CCGs, and within the CCGs to actually make this real and transparent in day-to-day life. I'm just wondering how we're going to have that conversation.
I think there's a number of mechanisms within these proposals that will help with that, including the requirement around communication, around publication, the taking of the internal audit reports, plus also our own assessment processes. So Victor, as you rightly highlight, as part of quarterly assessment of CCG performance, there is reporting now around the performance of delegated functions, for example, and examination of conflicts of interest within the annual review and assessment by NHS England of CCGs. I think you're also absolutely right in highlighting that this is about continuing to emphasise across all CCGs the good practice that exists in many around the implementation of management of conflicts of interest. The proposals that we're describing today are de minimis requirements. There are a number of CCGs that go considerably further than this. I can think of a number of CCGs that have 4 or more lay members and very clear potentially tighter arrangements that they've devised for their specific locality. And we'd certainly continue to encourage people to examine what makes most sense for their local community. But what we are looking to do is to ensure that there is an absolute consistency, minimum requirements that are executed across all CCGs for precisely the reason that David highlighted.
And I think the use of the conflict of interest guardian, that sounds like a bit of a wishy-washy role, but actually it's absolutely at the core of making the audit committee chairman, who is independent, appropriately qualified, to be able to oversee and make sure that the minimum standards are implemented. That means we have a mechanism and an accountability to be able to work with them and support them, and also to assure that the relevant processes are taking place.
Moira.
Agree with all those points that absolutely essential that this is done. But to ask whether, because I think that people get it or need help to get it, and training is vital. Is this training ready to go that we are providing? Will they be asked to report on how many people have done it by when, as it were? And secondly, a more general point really, which is that the likelihood is that there will be more noise around conflicts of interest because of this, so that people might get the sense of actually things are getting worse when they're actually getting better, but it's just worth recognising that's part of it.
So on the training point, this represents an upgrade in the work that has hitherto been carried out. So, for example, as part of the work on co-commissioning of primary medical services, we did instigate a process of training all lay members and audit committee chairs. We're going further now in terms of the expectation of training for CCG staff. And that's one of the reasons why there is an implementation gap between the closure of a consultation and the go-live date of November, so that we can implement that proposition. I think, Maura, you're right to highlight that increased transparency will inevitably mean that where there are conflicts, the wider public will become aware of those conflicts. I think the question as to public confidence will be less to do with the existence of the conflicts than the efficacy and the demonstrable efficacy with which they've been handled.
May we invite you then to move to the next stage, in which I declare an interest?
Thank you, Malcolm. So, looking beyond the commissioning system to this wider question of the identification and management of conflicts of interest across the NHS. The problem that we're highlighting here is not unique to the UK. It's a global issue, as illuminated, for example, by disclosures under the Sunshine Act in the United States of £6.5 billion worth of side payments to clinicians in 2014. Our ambition is not to set back appropriate partnership working with industry and other organisations, but to bring what I think is an overdue transparency and clarity to what is and is not acceptable behaviour. And this issue is, as I say, far wider than just being a matter for NHS England and the commissioning system. It's about all of the national bodies, it's about commissioners, it's about providers, clinicians, and indeed other staff. So the proposal in the paper is that NHS England helps lead and convene a system-wide group to tackle this issue, to establish a clear set of principles, de minimis rules, and effective means of enforcing these under your leadership, Malcolm, to produce proposals for consultation this summer. The Department of Health and the 5-year Forward View Board, comprising the chief executives of the arm's length bodies, have considered and welcome this proposal. And so I'm inviting the board to consider the proposal, to agree to it, and also to note, turning to the third point, that NHS England will be seeking to embed the principles already enumerated and the rules within its own internal processes.
Thank you. So let me invite comments on parts 2 and 3 of the paper. Margaret?
I was waving my hand about in connection with part 1, but
Apologies, I didn't see it.
Right, I had a few points, and in a way they're attached or aligned with some of the points that Moira made. First of all, I'm very supportive of what's being proposed here. What I think would be helpful is if we could actually clarify when we're asking for declarations that are actually conflicts of interest rather than declarations of pecuniary or money's worth. And by that I mean that the difference between when somebody has a relationship interest because they're sitting on one body and wear a hat that involves another body, by comparison to the sorts of declarations that are obviously required to eradicate bribery and facilitation payments and so on. and that's quite important. The next point that I wanted to make was that, albeit that transparency is the watchword, and it's really critical that we should have regular declarations, this shouldn't become a burden, and I just wonder whether a quarterly declaration is a step too far and whether half yearly would be enough. Having said that, I completely endorse the requirement for constant training and awareness, and one of the really important things in connection with that is that there should be a very clear notification or report, I suppose, on how the training is being recorded, as Moira rightly said, and I'm very pleased with the fact that you've removed the negative connotations of sort of whistleblowing, but that the audit function and the way in which the champion is being described is still gives people the opportunity to use that individual as part of a mechanism for flagging up concerns. And I think that should be underlined so that it's a positive thing, but because it's going to somebody who is in charge of audit, it does mean that one can monitor trends. And I think that's actually enormously helpful to enable review so that we can see whether the process is becoming too onerous or indeed where tweaks are necessary in policy. Sorry for the lateness of that.
Thank you, Margaret. On your first point, thank you for your distinction between different types of conflict of interest, wearing, as you say, different hats as opposed to financial inducements, I think is very well made. And this whole terrain is, there are a variety of different shades of grey, and what we need to do is to make sure we've got effective arrangements that recognise the complexity of those different arrangements, including legitimate partnership arrangements that exist around research, academic work, and obviously what we don't want to do is to set those back. The question about burdens and transparency, I think, is also very well made. It's something that the new cross-system group will need to consider in relation to the wider guidance. So, for example, to what level within organisations does one go down in insisting on declarations in advance from staff? And I think we will need to discuss and debate that. At the moment, for 15-16, as part of the CCG assessment process, there is a quarterly self-certification process, which is then followed up by the Commissioning Operations Directorate and regional colleagues. I do not believe that is overly burdensome. It's a relatively simple process, and I think we should clearly look at the degree of burden within the totality of these proposals. Your suggestion around can we record and understand and learn from the completeness of the training programs and the efficacy of the training programs is a very helpful suggestion and one that we will take away. And finally, I completely agree with your point around the conflict of interest guardian and the audit chair and the use that will have in highlighting to staff an alternative option to going down the formal whistleblowing route. So thank you.
Other questions, comments around the cross-system proposal that Ian's outlined?
The only point I would to make, I think, is that there are issues in relation to this that go beyond financial and financial interests. They're also about access to and influence interests, and it's a gradation, isn't it, from organisations that actually behave quite poorly in pretending to be something that they're not, access, right through to actually not-for-profit organisations that are small but actually need access, but also have perceived conflicts of interest. And it's just a point that we need to be open and transparent about how that works. and because it's part of this issue, when you're spending 118 billion quid, who gets access is an issue.
Yes.
So there's something about how we build that into this piece of work, but also how we might learn who's getting access to what and how and indeed why.
Absolutely. And one of the, I think, steps that Simon instigated on arrival in April 2014 was a new requirement that all national directors publish details of all of the meetings that they have with external organisations. That's one example, I think, Victor, of the way in which we can increase transparency, and we need to consider how we may go further than that initial step as we develop wider system rules and then apply them to our own business. Not just obviously individuals, but also the work of committees and formal decision-making structures.
Make three very quick points that haven't come out in discussion, but which are implied in the paper, and I think it's worth people just clocking. First is that obviously we as NHS England fund high-cost drugs and devices on a pass-through basis in specialised commissioning, and therefore we have a very strong interest in ensuring that decisions that are made clinically are not being influenced by non-clinical considerations, shall we say, or the overall interests of taxpayers. So the reason why Malcolm, the work that Malcolm will be leading across the NHS as a whole is so important is not just is the right thing for patients, but also because it directly affects our £15 billion specialised commissioning budget. Secondly, I think we should welcome and build on the work that the ABPI and the ABHI have kicked off in terms of disclosures and voluntary registers, but frankly some of that may need strengthening to ensure that individuals can't opt out of the arrangements that they're putting in place, and that's one of the things that Malcolm's group will obviously be wanting to consider. And then thirdly, some of the concern that has arisen locally has been around the distributed decision making around pharmaceutical formularies in CCGs or multiple CCG levels and the source of advice that they are receiving. And so one of the proposals here is that actually we will rationalise, set out of paragraph 28, these medicines and formularies committees so there aren't oodles of them dotted all over the country subject to these kind of strange influences. And I think that will have the benefit both of protecting the purity of the decision processes and also, frankly, from the point of view of the pharmaceutical industry, reducing the number of the multiple points of interaction they have so that there's a clearer, more transparent, streamlined process.
I've got about timescale. Malcolm, it says that you will have proposals for consultation in the summer.
Yes. I think the scale of this task should not be underestimated, actually. We're stretching right across.
Expectations management by
Just calm down the expectations, if you wouldn't mind. Let's do some preliminary work and come back to the next meeting of the board with a realistic timetable, with membership of the cross-system group, and some further thinking about the method that we'll follow over the coming months. Thank you, Moira, for that. On the basis that everybody's body language seems to be encouragingly positive, may I propose to you, is it still?
I've got conflicts of interest with Leeds, I'm afraid, so I will stop that.
Right, okay. We'll put that into the register. But before you go, are we happy to approve the publication of the consultation paper on statutory guidance for CCGs, approve the setting up of the cross-system task and finish group, and approve proposals to significantly strengthen our own conflict of interest policy? Good. Thank you very much.